Eric, I like different concepts of God because it gives me a sense of what the possibilities may be, even if I reject them all. You have a concept of God that is both non-traditional and exciting in its absolute bizarre nature. I say that as a
I've
compliment.
done my job then.
I say that as a compliment.
Okay, sure.
In this world, bizarre is good. So tell me how your gods work.
Well, I think that there are infinitely many gods, and they're little g gods, not big G God. So
What does that mean?
it's a kind of polytheism. But it's not polytheism that says there are lots of gods in our world, like Zeus or Thor or something like that.
Tree gods and
they don't exist, right? Our world is just physical. It's just the physical world described by science. That's our universe. But our universe should be thought of as being generated by a little g God. So if you take the cosmological argument, which says there's going to be a necessary ground of the physicality of our universe, a necessary being that is the foundation of all the contingent things in our universe, that's our local God, our local little g God. And then you might ask, well, where did that come from? There's always this question with the big G God, well, who made God?
Right.
And so I answer that. Well, what would you think would make a God, if not another God? And so I'll actually continue to run a cosmological argument backwards. And so our God that made our universe was designed and created by a prior God, which of course has its own universe. And that was designed and created by an even prior God. And we run all the way back until we get to the simplest of all possible gods, which is the root of this whole branching tree of gods. And that first simple little God is a necessary being, an ultimate necessary being. It exists and is the root of the rest of this endlessly ramified tree.
Now, a typical theist would say that's a coherent argument, but you can eliminate all those intermediary steps. And you can just assume that the God of this universe is that primordial, simple, necessary being that you have all the way step back. What justification do you have for all of those intermediary little gods?
That's a really good question. The traditional theists, they posit this God that's very complex. Now, they would like to say that it's metaphysically simple, but you know what? That doesn't work. I mean, our universe is complicated. And anything that could design our universe has to be a very complicated thing. Now, I take a lot of this from Dawkins. I mean, I was very inspired by Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, where he actually says things like, if our universe really was designed, he says he doesn't believe that, but he says if it were, the designer would have to come from somewhere. And the only way that there could be a designer of our universe would be if the designer evolved. If it came from prior designers that were simpler and prior designers that were even simpler, and all the way back. So I really get it from him.
So a motivation that you have is and a premise is that for the universe that you find yourself in, this complex
this one right here,
you need a complicated God. And
that's right.
And so that's a premise that you have.
That's right.
So your challenge is how am I going to build one? How am I going to find one? How am I going to find one that evolves? How can I get a complicated God? And I can't start with complicated.
Right.
I have to start with simple. So I have to have a process. Am I getting that?
That's right.
Am I following along?
You are.
Being
it's an
proper
evolutionary
acolyte to
I hope not an acolyte. Got to be critical. But it's an evolutionary idea. So gods evolve. Right. So the little gods. This is a little anthropomorphic, and I don't like that, but let's go with it. It's a metaphor. The little gods beget bigger gods, and the bigger gods beget even bigger gods.
Now, when you're talking
they
about
grow more complex,
when you're using these size metaphors, the little gods are more primordial and closer to the necessary being, because one of those, the littlest God in your framework, is the necessary God, because that's the first one that started the process.
Well, they're all necessary in a sort of metaphysical sense, and that might be a little technical. But let's leave that for a minute. The first God, the littlest God, is a first cause.
Okay.
In a traditional theistic sense, it's the first cause, but and in a traditional theistic sense, it's simple. Now, not in the extreme sense of being completely compressed into itself, but you should think of it as like a little simple computer. It's just very simple, and it does just a few little things, and it can just generate a tiny little universe, maybe with a a dot in it, or a point, with 0 dimensions.
But it also can produce an offspring of itself.
That's right. And so
many offspring or just one?
Sure.
We don't know.
Well, at some point it's going to be many. I mean, my idea is that you take a classical concept of perfection that just gives you this big one thing that's infinitely perfect. And I say that I don't understand I understand if you go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you get up to infinity.
Yeah.
I don't understand just saying infinity. Right? So I kind of took from Dawkins the idea that let's apply this reasoning to gods. An evolutionary process, which he himself says. He says if there's a designer, then the designer must have evolved.
With his tongue halfway through his cheek.
Yeah, but he's sort of got, because, he doesn't say God doesn't exist, I'm certain. He says God, the big G God, probably doesn't exist.
Okay.
Well, sure, but he's got a backup.
Yeah.
Right? He's got this backup plan.
And you're developing the mechanism for it.
I'm trying to say that actually is good theology.
Okay.
Right? That's good theology, is to start out with a first simple cause, the little God that makes bigger gods.
Okay. And when you say bigger, they mean more complicated, more powerful, more knowing.
Right. More powerful, more intelligent.
And each one creates universes and other God offspring. So the two things that they do?
It's two things that they do in one sense, but in another sense, it's just really sort of one thing. I mean, each God, I would like to think of universes, as John Leslie does, as being sort of inside the God. It's not.
Okay.
It's more like the gods are minds, or like I like to use the computer image, the computer metaphor, and say like you think of a computer that generates a virtual world or a video game or something.
Right, and that's inside of it.
Yeah, but you should think of it that way.
When it creates the new generation of evolving gods, those are really independent.
They're independent, separate beings.
Right.
But what you've got is a God that's got a universe inside of itself, and so when it creates offspring of itself, sort of in its own image, they too will be things that have universes inside of themselves.
Right.
So it looks, you can separate it and say there are two kinds of creativity, but really it's just unified.
Order of magnitude of the number of these things, these little g gods floating around.
Floating around.
Yeah, sort of multi-dimensional space or whatever you're...
Well, no, they're not in any space.
Yeah.
There's no space for them to be in.
But they're in, they don't overlap.
No, but they're more like, think of them more like sets or numbers. They are, although they are concrete, they're the ultimate concrete things.
They are concrete.
They are concrete. They're the ultimate concrete things.
But they act like abstract objects, like one is like the number 8 and the other like the number 13.
They look like that because they're not dependent on any other concrete things that are, except other gods, right? So it is it sounds a little funny, right?
It's okay. I can deal with that.
And we can visualize it in a kind of big logical space, if you want to say it that way. But it's not like space that you and I live in.
For sure. And so, order of magnitude, how many about you got around now?
Lots,
yeah.
But I'll answer in a technical mathematical sense that I won't make technical, but just to say, infinitely many in the sense that mathematicians mean infinite.
Okay.
Which is big.
Right. But it's not. But it didn't start out that way. It started out because you told me there was originally one or very few necessary little ones.
That's right.
So it's growing towards infinity in a sense, or.
Well, I'd like to push a little bit more back to the mathematical analogy, which is to say they're like numbers in that sense. So they all exist.
But numbers, I don't think you would say started to exist with the number 1 and then added to them. When you think of numbers, they all happened at the same time, right?
That's correct. And so but think about it. When you have numbers, you can count, right? 0, 1, 2, 3. So you can understand it as a sequence that's kind of temporal.
Right.
Now, you're right, the numbers as they're standardly thought of by, Plato and Platonists, right, just exist. And I'd like to think of these little g gods as just existing.
Even though one caused the other, or one begat the other, or whatever.
Yeah, that's kind of metaphorical.
Okay.
Right? In other words, you and I are going to look at these things with our minds from our, spatio-temporal ways of thinking about things. So I don't mind the metaphorical talk at all. I don't mind if we say, there's little baby gods that grow up and beget other gods, but that's really metaphorical, right? And when it gets more precise, which it also gets more technical and harder to understand, then we got to think a bit more mathematically or a bit more computer science-like.
So as you look at the whole scheme of a lot of little gods that are getting bigger and bigger, and none of them ever reach the so-called big God that is of traditional theistic. None of them reach that absolute, infinite knowledge, power, goodness, freedom, whatever you have. None of them can ever reach that.
Right. None of them ever reach. That's our friend Pog,
Yeah.
the personal omni-God.
Yeah.
Right. So there's no Pog.
Right.
None of them ever reach Pog. There just isn't any Pog.
So you can explain the problem of evil much more easily than a pog a theist,
a Pogist.
a pogist, because your God is just not good, not powerful enough, not knowledgeable enough, not.
Well, each God does the best it can when it creates, but you might have, a little kid does the best they can in making a little house, but it's not going to be a very good house. But then, the next iteration does better.
And we have no idea whether our universe is inside an early stage God that was very limited in power, or a later stage God. We have no idea.
Well, I think we have we can make some very educated guesses, right? In other words, we can look at physics and we can look at the kind of infinities or numbers involved in physics. And now there's debate. Is our universe finite or infinite ultimately? And that's a debated question. So when we get answers like that, answers to those kinds of questions from scientists, I intend this to be a very naturalistic kind of view. It doesn't posit gods don't interfere with the world. Gods are things that very logically, in a kind of programmatic way, generate worlds. So I think of the gods as like computers that are running our universe, like a computer might run a video game or some sort of internal simulation of a universe. But it's real. And so how big might our God be? Well, we have to turn to the scientists to answer questions about the complexity of our universe. That's going to be related to the complexity of our God.
And when you mean big, you mean how capable is that God in creating
That's right.
the universe, the complexity, the coherence, the goodness, whatever you want, whatever criteria you want. Right.
I use big like for computers, bigger, faster, more powerful, intelligent computer.
Right. And ultimately, what are the advantages of having this basically infinite sequence of gods, even the best one of which is still not all powerful, all good, and all anything? What advantages does that give you over a traditional theism?
Right. The advantages that it gives me over having all these gods gives me over traditional theism is I avoid, or this polytheistic position avoids, a lot of the problems of traditional theism. So I don't have any paradoxes of omniscience or omnipotence in this system, right? I can give a perfectly literate and scientific account of how gods generate their worlds. In other words, a scientific, naturalistic account of creation and design, right? For the traditional theist, it's a complete mystery how God designs and creates the world. And you're just told, well, he does it, right? So I solve these paradoxes of omniscience and omnipotence. Can God create a stone so big that God can't lift it? Does God know that God knows, etc.? And that's all classical stuff. Those are problems. I avoid all those. I avoid, most importantly, the logical problem of evil, right? And
because your God is not all powerful, not all good.
Well, they're all good in a certain sense.
Not all good, not perfectly good.
Not perfect in that omni-good sense. That's right. They're doing the best they can, but they may not be able to do as well as the next guy, right? The next God. So we avoid the logical problem of evil, right? So that's, a number of problems that are avoided so far. And I can answer questions like if somebody comes up to me and says, where do you believe in these gods? Where does your God come from? I can say, well, it came from a simpler God.
But on that one, you lose, because you still have to have a primordial God that was a necessary being. The only difference you have a very simple God is the initial one.
That's right.
And I'm not sure if that's better or worse.
I think it's better if you then positing a God that, there's a contradiction here, right? Also a paradox for the traditional theists, the Pog people, that they want to say things like, well, their God is a simple first cause, but it's capable of designing things and it knows everything. Now, I don't understand how a simple thing can have knowledge of everything, or how a simple thing can be a person, The only people I know are incredibly complicated things, right? So there is an advantage here, right? I've solved a problem that traditional theism or pog theism can't solve without, a lot of equivocation about, well, yeah, but sure, simple things can be people and can have incredibly complex minds. And when you press them on that, there's no answer. So I'd like to say, and I think also that it's a good answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Well, you're going to start with some necessary beings. That's one traditional way of answering it. But I always think complexity needs to be explained, right? So simple things don't require as much explanatory work. And presumably the ultimate simple things require a minimal amount of explanatory work. And you really can say, well, yeah, that's why. We don't need anything simpler to explain these simple initial little god or little gods. You could challenge that, right? Certainly. But that's why I think it's advantageous.